And welcome to another edition of South Texas Crossfire. This is Attorney Joe Flores reminding you to join us each and every week right here on KTMV with our Spectrum Now subscribers that has been replaced, that has replaced Time Warner rather. And we are very lucky to have on not only, we had on a special guest earlier, and that was Kyle Holscher and his movement with normalcc.org. But now we're going to be moving on to other social issues that are plaguing our society. And who better than a law professor and also somebody who formerly sat on the bench in the federal system, and that is Brian Owsley. Welcome, sir.
Great to be here.
Oh,
Good
thank
to see
you.
you, Joe.
Last time we did a sort of picture interview with a radio thing, but now in vivo. You know, can you tell us a little bit about your education, training, background, where you grew up?
Sure. I'm originally from Indiana, South Bend, Indiana, born, bred, and raised. I attended the University of Notre Dame, which is right there, essentially.
Fighting Irish.
Fighting Irish. Go Irish. I'm wearing my...
Yes.
Getting ready to go back up there for reunion shortly.
Fun.
And then I attended law school and got a graduate degree in Masters in International Affairs at Columbia University in New York City. And
so nothing to sneeze at. You've had quite an education, but at a price. You know, we're going to talk about race. You happen to be African American.
I am.
And, you know, people say, oh, well, what? Wait a minute, you know. And, you know, when people obviously look at me, they say Latino or, you know, Arab if I'm in London. So let's talk about the social ills that still pervade our society. You mentioned before I said, what would you like to talk about? And one of them being what is happening with race in this country, being so divided. What's the message or what's on your mind, please?
Well, I mean, what I referenced was just the inability to do anything as an African American these days without someone calling 911. For example, one of the most recent incidents, well, we're, I think, probably all aware of the incident out in Philadelphia with Starbucks and the two gentlemen who had been there a couple minutes and were waiting for a third person, and the manager called 911 because they were standing there and hadn't ordered anything. I think we've all been to coffee shops, we've hung out, we wait for people, but these two gentlemen, they weren't extended that courtesy. The most recent one that comes to my mind is the woman at Yale. She was a grad student. She was in a dorm. There was a common area. She happened to, I guess, be dozing off and taking a nap in the common area. And another student called the campus security police on her because she didn't belong there, apparently, and that was the appropriate thing. I think the thing about 911 in general is, one, I think the statistics bear it out that African Americans typically do not call 911, or not with the same rate of frequency as white folks do, in part because there's a concern and distrust of police in general within the community, but also there's the realization that when you bring the police, they are bringing all that comes to bear. So, for example, if we think back to Cleveland or Ohio, there's Tamir Rice, a young 12-year-old African-American kid who was playing in the park. Someone called 911. They were playing with water guns. The police arrived on the scene and immediately shot and killed him. Similarly, John Crawford III, African-American gentleman who was in a Walmart who was looking at a BB gun that they sold at the Walmart. Someone called 911 on him for having a gun. Mind you, this is in Walmart. Walmart is the largest seller of firearms in the country, and this was not even a firearm, this was a BB gun. Still can do damage with it, but nonetheless, he was looking at something that was legal to sell in the Walmart, and police came in and shot him. So when we think about Starbucks or what happened at Yale, yes, those incidents ended relatively innocuously, in the sense that no one was physically harmed, but there's this undertone or this current that we cannot participate in just sort of basic activities of social life without being called into question and being essentially told that folks aren't welcomed, or they're in places that they're not expected to be. There was a kid, I think it was up in Michigan recently, who I think, if I understand it correctly, he didn't have his phone because he had done something and his mother had taken it away from him. But he missed his bus. And so to get to school, he was walking through a neighborhood to get to school. He knocked on a door to ask for directions, and the guy tried to shoot him. So, there is just this notion that we cannot participate in sort of basic, ordinary, life. So that's, I guess, sort of the issue as I see it.
Books like the new Jim Crow laws, where, emancipation, and then 100 years later we finally freed African Americans, quote unquote, in this country, but the struggle remains.
Right.
1 out of 3 African Americans is on supervised release or incarcerated. The privatization of prisons, 1 out of 5 Latinos, and then 1 out of 20 whites. So the disparity is there. What is your take on the privatization of prisons and making them be on the stock market?
Well, one, I mean, you referred to the new Jim Crow, and Michelle Alexander has a great book out there. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Excellent.
But the problem with sort of private prisons in general is we are commodifying something that society should be doing warily, right? I mean, so in other words, and we've seen recent reports about Jeff Sessions owning stock in some of these private corporation companies, and then he comes out with policies about we are going to increase incarceration. Well, that somewhat it directly benefits him. We shouldn't be sort of putting people in prison, making that a profit source for anybody. And so, in my experience when I was on the bench, dealing with the for-profit prison entities, there was seemingly some corruption. And there was also, they will cut corners at all costs because they're working on behalf of the shareholders. And and we see this all throughout corporate America. One of the reasons we had this huge recession with the housing industry collapse and the bubble is because we were giving large bonuses to people generating revenue when they weren't making prudent decisions. And here with for-profit prison corporations, it's in the interest of the CEOs and the upper management of these corporations to cut costs as low as possible. And the way you do that is you reduce the amount of food or the quality of the food. You reduce access to medical care. You reduce access to libraries and recreation. You reduce everything, and you are just warehousing people, essentially independent of any sort of treatment as a human being.
A retiring judge once told me, when I'm a big healthcare advocate for the prisoners, when they need a filling, they remove a tooth. When they need a pain med, they give them Tylenol, even if they've broken a limb. It's almost like parting the Red Sea to get a Lortab or a Tylenol number 3 for a person that's in prison. I've seen flare-ups of gout where the person can't even walk and was not afforded a wheelchair. People have not received their psychiatric meds and committed suicide. And also people, a trooper, as we've seen, I think while you were on the bench, had a massive heart attack and had symptoms for days and didn't get an EKG on time to see what his heart was doing. And he was, fallen from grace as a trooper but died. So we've had real deaths in there. And the other thing that Michelle brings out in her book, The Jim Crow Laws, who I've reached out to, is that now slave labor is back. Because companies like J.C. Penney and also military contractors are using prisoners to work for free to build missiles, to make clothing, and this is a well-kept secret. And so you have primarily African Americans, again, being in prison, working for free or for pennies.
Yeah. And on some level, we always had that a little bit on some. I mean, when I was growing up, the joke was if you went to the state prison, you made license plates, right? But that was work for the state, right? And I remember at some point there were, prison-made pens. But yeah, we're branching out to all kinds of things that are profit sources for the prisons, whether they are private or state-run. So you have this tendency to, and the inmates get a slight amount, a very, very slight amount of the money. And if you are someone who cares about the marketplace, it skews the market. It skews the market. If someone is making T-shirts for you much cheaper, it's going to adversely impact, prevent any ability from someone in what people call the free world from getting a job making a shirt on the outside, because the costs for paying that person are so much higher than it is for paying maybe an inmate quarter an hour, 50 cents an hour, whatever they're receiving per hour in their commissary account. So,
well, and we have the argument, Kathy Lee Gifford, others have been called on the carpet recently for using foreign, workers to work for pennies or chained to their workstation, but yet we have prisoners doing the same thing here in this country. Let's talk a little bit about Bill Clinton, who led the charge for tougher crime. When the crime bills came around, a lot of people don't understand how the federal system works. 95% or more plea, and they plead to things because they're afraid to get a lot of more time. So what are mandatory minimums? I think people don't understand the concept of why people plead guilty to crack versus powder cocaine, things like that. So when you sat on the bench, what was your experience seeing people plea? Because I know you'd asked him, are you guilty because you are guilty and for no other reason? And essentially some of these people are lying. They're saying, I'm guilty because they should say the truth. I'm guilty because I'm afraid I'm going to get whacked harder.
Yeah. No doubt the system that was created in the 90s created a disincentive from going to trial. In other words, regardless of whether you were guilty or not, it was in your interest to plead guilty because you would get less time. If you weren't guilty and you rolled the dice and you went to trial, you were going to be penalized on top of being convicted. You were going to get a stiffer sentence for taking the government to trial. And you referenced disparities between powder cocaine and crack cocaine. I think the disparity I may be wrong on this, was about 200 to 1. But in other words, if you had a gram of powder cocaine versus a gram of crack cocaine, that gram of crack cocaine was going to get you a significantly stiffer penalty for that crime. Now that was a problem in how we view, and we see this coming back around now. There's a lot of compassion for opiates these days, and people who are addicted to opiates, and it's a horrific problem. But back in the day when folks were addicted to crack, the idea was, well, we're just going to lock them up and throw away the key. Whereas now we have this opioid addiction that's wreaking havoc throughout the United States, and the notion is, well, we're going to view this as a different kind of problem And I think that's the right idea. The problem is for some folks in the African American community is it appears that the opioid addiction is adversely impacting white folks, and when it was happening to black folks with crack, then the mantra was lock them up and throw away the key. So you have that development as well.
What have you seen as the impact of mass incarceration in the African community, fathers going away, and the erosion of a sort of loaded question, but what have you seen when you see the impact of people being incarcerated on a mass scale?
Well, I mean, I think anytime you have access to viable figures in your life, whether it's a father, a mother, whoever it is, if you lose out on that, your social network, your familial network is weakened. And so we have the problem where, as you alluded to, so many people are already tied up into the criminal justice system that has problems in terms of, are they available to foster or mentor their own children? They're disenfranchised often from voting and participating in civic life. So there's a whole host of things. They find it harder to get jobs and good jobs. So if you're incarcerated, often, especially if it's early on, you're missing educational opportunities. And so I think, in this day and age, even just a high school diploma is not good enough. But if you are having that interrupted, that doesn't bode well. I don't think that a GED helps too many people. And quite honestly, I'm not sure a high school diploma assists people too often these days in and of itself.
What would you tell young people out there that maybe live in high-risk areas that there are drugs around, cops are more vigilant around those areas, particularly in the Latino and the African American community, especially in the political climate right now? What might be something, as a former judge that sat on the bench and heard a lot of federal crimes going through, setting bond and whatnot, what might you want to tell them about the system?
I think they need to know their rights. This is, as someone who is on the bench and someone who teaches federal criminal procedure now, you have to know your rights. You have to know what the police can do and what they can't do. You also have to be, unfortunately, not just respectful, but maybe overly respectful. But you are not helping yourself by talking to them. No matter how smart you are, you cannot talk your way out of it. The only thing that I want you to say to law enforcement or whoever it is when you're in a jam is lawyer. That is the only thing that is going to help you, because you will not be able to talk your way out of it. And there were plenty of times when I was reviewing criminal complaints and I talked to the agent. I was like, if they hadn't talked, you wouldn't be able to really charge them. He's like, yeah. Typically that was the case, and you see that now. So you need to be aware of what the police can do to you, what your rights are. We don't teach civics in school the way we used to, so people don't appreciate their rights. This was, I think, a big thing for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and we need to focus on ensuring that people know their rights. That doesn't prevent you from getting abused, getting beaten, or anything like that. But there is no way you're going to talk your way out of probably an arrest. And anything you say, as Miranda, we know from the movies and TV shows, can and may be used against you. Typically, you are not smart enough to talk your way out of it. Now, I mean, and everyone I saw when I was on the bench was someone who hadn't talked their way out of it, and often had talked their way into more problems. And you would know this as a criminal defense attorney reading a complaint, and you're like, oh, why did my client say X, Y, and Z? If my client had just been quiet, I would have had a little bit easier place to make a defense, to push the government to its burdens in a way where the government might have had a harder task. They might have been willing to drop the charges. They might have been able to reduce the charges. It might have impacted sentencing. So my thing is, don't assist the government, don't assist law enforcement by essentially making statements that aren't going to help you.
A lot of people don't know the police officer on a stop. Can they lie to you?
Oh, yeah.
So a police officer stopping you or a federal agent can tell you something that's not true.
Sure.
Such as?
Well, so I don't know about the stop so much, but, you know, I guess if they stop you and they could say, look, we just caught your buddy, and said, and he's confessing that you both were involved in the break-in. Is there something you want to tell me? You know, they can do that. So the way I see it in you know, when I'm teaching criminal procedure is, you know, in interrogations, you can have good cop, bad cop. You can say, look, we got your co-defendant or your you know buddy in the other room, and one of you guys is going to get a deal, and he's starting to talk. You know, and the guy may not even be arrested, may not be saying anything, maybe denying it everything like you know you are, but they can say that, and it's been held to be constitutional to make those types of lies.
How long can somebody be detained without an arrest and without seeing their lawyer?
Well, I mean, it varies state to state. I mean, my sense in some state jurisdictions, you can go a fair amount of time, but in federal, typically, what would happen is someone's arrested, and they would have that criminal complaint presented to a neutral judge, a magistrate judge, within 48 hours. So that doesn't necessarily mean they see that judge, because let's say someone gets arrested late Wednesday or sometime Thursday. The judge may not see the criminal complaint until Saturday, but that person's not going to be appearing before the judge until Monday. And then they typically at that initial appearance will request an attorney and be provided an attorney, and then it's 3 days later from that. So that's a situation where you can envision a week from time of arrest to time where you may see your attorney, in the sense of if the attorney shows up on the date of the preliminary hearing or arraignment, detention hearing, those types of judicial courtroom events.
Well, you're watching South Texas Crossfire. We're here interviewing a law professor and also former federal judge, magistrate, and that is none other than a good friend and friend to us, educating us, Brian Owsley. And we'll be back after these messages. And we're back after a brief break. You're watching South Texas Crossfire, and I've got a great friend to all of us here because he's a law professor. He's sat on the bench in the federal court as a magistrate, and he is here to talk about, in this segment, about law school, whether you should go or not. Many nurses, like myself, that were in the healthcare field or physicians went back to law school, but some of you out there, your dream is to become a lawyer. And many people say there's too many lawyers. Well, my pitch is there's not enough good ones. So let's talk about the law school that Judge Owsley, now Professor Owsley, is at, and let's visit about that law school. Welcome back.
Thank you. So yeah, I agree with your statement wholeheartedly that there are not enough good attorneys, and so I'm up in Dallas at UNT Dallas College of Law. It's a relatively new law school. We are just finishing our 4th year. We're about to graduate our 2nd class of our graduating class. And we got last year provisional accreditation. We're working hard to get full accreditation. Provisional accreditation is just a first step. So our graduates now can sit for the bar in any state. They have the ability to, basically the rights that would be afforded any other law graduate of another law school. When I say accreditation, I mean by the ABA. And so we have, we're expecting a new dean. So our original dean was former federal judge Royal Ferguson, who served as our inaugural dean, and he's stepping down as of July 1. And we are expecting a new dean, Dean Felicia Epps, who comes most recently from Florida A&M. She had been a dean there for a while. She has a lot of experience working at the University of Arkansas. She is a former JAG officer in the Marine Corps and worked in Georgia legal aid. And one of the things about our law school, we're a little bit different, I think, than many law schools, is we have a mission, one, of increasing diversity within the legal community. So we have a high rate of people of color who are attending our law school, whether that's Hispanics, African Americans, people of Asian descent. I think, if I remember looking at the numbers relatively recently for the incoming class, we're about 40% or so. We have about half of our incoming classes is women, which when I went to law school, I think my class was roughly 38%, and that was not uncommon. So, but also we are getting people who are interested in providing services, and this is part of our mission, to people who can't afford legal services. You and I both know that a good lawyer does not come cheap. There are plenty in the middle class and lower middle class who cannot afford an attorney for whatever reason, or whatever legal matter, whether it's some family matter or some kind of contract dispute or whatever it is. It's just too expensive to retain good, competent legal counsel often. And so we're working on trying to develop attorneys who are going to go out and do that. One of the ways we do that is that our tuition is relatively low. So I think our tuition is a little less currently than $17,000 a year, which I appreciate is a lot of money, but I think out of roughly 200 law schools that are ABA accredited, there are only a handful, maybe 5, that are cheaper than our law school, and none of them are in the state of Texas. We're a state institution. Now, I want to point out that because we're inexpensive doesn't mean that you're not getting a quality education. So we are also, I think, on the cutting edge of legal education, and by that I mean when you and I went to law school, we took what I characterize as the winner-take-all final exam.
Yeah.
So in my class, for example, I'll have a midterm typically, I'll have a final exam, but I'll have maybe at least 10 different quizzes throughout the semester. We'll have homework assignments. So I'm constantly reinforcing the lessons that we're having through our reading and through our class discussions. Moreover, we have a very strong emphasis on experiential learning. I don't know what it was like for you, but most of my courses were essentially just doctrinal courses, and that's important. You need to understand the specific areas of law. But when I graduated, I was probably unable to go into a courtroom and do much of anything of use to anybody. And it's our hope and our goal that we're training our students through clinics, through practicums, through externships, and other skills-based learning that we bring into the classroom to actually go out and be better attorneys. For example, I've referenced I teach federal criminal procedure. One of my assignments is they have to write a motion to suppress. So everyone gets at least that opportunity of, thinking like a lawyer and practicing on being a lawyer. If you have a client who can come in, and we have classes where you're taught how to interview and counsel. We're taught we teach people how to negotiate. So, and those are required courses, which are unique, I think, to law schools around the country. You referenced nurses. I think nurses going to law school is phenomenal. That there's lots of opportunities because, of course, you can go in and just be an attorney. By that I mean you could maybe leave your nursing practice behind or your nursing experience. But I think coupling it in a whole host of ways is phenomenal. You can be someone who has the ability to be a medical expert. And will be sought after because of your knowledge about medicine and your understanding of the legal system in the process. You can be a better advocate on behalf of people who have maybe medical-related claims because of your awareness about how medicine works and anatomy and things like that. You could also work in the healthcare profession as an attorney because you have a unique skill set. So I think nurses going to law school is great. We've had several at our institution. One other thing I would say about our institution is, and this may be of interest to nurses or anyone else, is, as I indicated, we're in Dallas. We have an evening program and a day program. So you can do the day program in 3 years. If you are someone, for example, who is a nurse and wanted to continue working as a nurse in Dallas, you could go part-time and achieve your goal of obtaining a JD while working part-time.
And one of the things that it's been 20 years for me since I sat in a classroom for the very first day. That'd be August 8th or August 12th, 1998, when I had my first day of law school. It was a Socratic method where you sat in the traditional, even the paper chase had the same thing. Yeah. They knew who you were, where you sat, seating chart, and discussion began about a case. And then people were asked to recite and stand up, read the facts of the case and all that. Is that a lot still going on, or is there online learning now? How has it morphed because of technology? Or is it still the same traditional thing at your school?
So, a couple of things. One, you mentioned online learning. I think you're seeing developments of that, not just in law or legal education, but across the board. I mean, for example, Arizona State is one of the large state institutions in Arizona, but they're also one of the leaders in online education as well. Our law school allows students to earn credits by taking online courses. I'm not sure if anyone has done it yet, but it is an option, and there are other programs out there that are developing online education. You referenced Socratic method. I think every teacher, at least on our faculty, is different in how they approach teaching and their method. I would say that I use the Socratic method on some part, but also, I mean, there are other things that we do that keep it different within the classroom, and every professor is different. One of the things that my colleagues and I talk about are just different ways of people learning, right? I mean, so there are visual learners, audio learners, kinetic learners, and you have to try to appeal to all of them because student A may learn in a very different way than student B does. And so in order to be effective, you want to try to reach across the spectrum of different learners.
Reaching those viewers, what's the best way to get a hold of your school, watch how it's progressed, learn about the professors? What is the website?
The website is www.untdallaslaw.edu.
UNTDallasLaw.edu.
Yes.
And for those people that are thinking about going into law school, as I always say, my mantra is, there may be a lot of lawyers, but not enough good ones that are willing to take on and champion those social causes that you and I have talked about. Particularly people of color are very underrepresented. The last stat I had was over 95% of prosecutors are white. And so I know that guys like George Soros, the antipathy towards the Koch brothers, made sure that he made an impact and tried to get in select areas prosecutors that were of color. Not necessarily, changing policy, but at least it gave it a fighting chance.
Right.
And I think that there's a lot of discretion that prosecutors have on the cases that they choose to go ahead and prosecute. Finally, I'd like to talk about your experiences being somebody of color, being on the bench, and seeing the treatment or the disparity. Did you see the immigration? I know you dealt a lot with people that were undocumented, many that were abused along the trail coming over here. You were here in deep South Texas. What sort of things would you like to see change now that you're off the bench and you can speak freely? What are some of the things that you think that you find unjust? And the policies that are in place right now, what would you change if you could?
So one of the things that I'm hoping to work on this summer, I have a research assistant and I've tasked her with doing the initial research, is when we think about undocumented folks, one, we can't go anywhere in this country, in this state, for example, and go into a restaurant and likely have people who are cleaning the tables, who are cleaning the dishes, who are cooking the food. If you want to go out and enjoy a nice meal, you have to be prepared for the fact that you are supporting often people who don't have legal status to work in this country. If you want your lawn cut, if you want your children cared for, if you want food on your table, I don't know who people think is picking the produce that makes it to H-E-B and various supermarkets around the state, but it's typically folks who are coming here who don't have legal status. It's not exclusively, but it's a lot of them. And without that assistance, the farmers, I think, if they're candid, would acknowledge that their produce would rot on the vine or grow rotten in the fields because they don't have the ability to get it all to market. So when we think about that, and so this goes back to my article, it's the same, it's Purdue chicken, Tyson chicken, pork plants, beef processing plants. There's always undocumented folks. We don't have a supply problem. We have a demand problem. And what we don't see is we see an attack on the people who come and do the work that seemingly no one else wants to do, or not enough people want to do. But we don't have any concern about the people who are bringing them in and hiring them. You want to solve this problem of undocumented folks? Well, one, it's going to cost Americans more, and that's fine. If everyone's cognizant and wants to make that payment, that's fine.
No.
But the way you do it is you stop the demand. So you go after the employers. You go after the entities building houses engaged in construction or whatever. You go after the processing plants that are using undocumented folks. You stop the ability of farmers from using it. You go into restaurants where the staff are people preparing the food or cleaning up after the food has been eaten. It's a demand problem, and if you stop the demand, if you go after the people seeking the supply, then you'll have a change. There won't be people coming here if there's no work. People come in part because they want to make a better life for themselves and their family, and there's work here that needs to be done.
The wall. You know, there's been a lot of hoopla about that, and then Mexico is going to pay for it. I haven't heard anything recently, but that
paid for that wall.
Yes, yes. Would a wall be a symbolic sort of deal that would work, or even if we completed it and went through landowner and riparian rights and going through all of these sort of land issues with people, particularly here in Texas, Arizona, would a wall work?
I don't think a wall is going to work because we've seen that, and this would be the same for folks, but for narcotics, people build tunnels. They go under the ground, not over it. And then, we have already wall along a lot of places across the southern border. The problem is people are going to come here, and you can build a wall and make it harder and more risky, but people are still coming, and we still need them because we still want produce on our plates. We want meat on our plates and things like that. We can't get around the need for people to do these jobs and the fact that people want to come and do the jobs.
Well, the hard truth of the matter is, I mean, you've heard it straight from somebody who has been on the bench, is teaching this now, and reaching out and also encouraging people to go to law school, particularly people of diversity. If you're, come from a diverse background, you are sadly mistaken if you think that the majority of lawyers are of color. There are too few and far in between. Now, if it's here in South Texas, you'll see a lot more Hispanic lawyers, but that's not the truth around the nation, and neither is it the truth for African Americans. So the website, once again, is UNT Dallas Law .edu. Take a look at it, and it's been a great interview. It's always a pleasure having you come by, and we'll have some lunch and talk about some more of this here shortly. But you've been listening to Professor Brian Owsley, and he is at UNT, and you can visit him. The website is up there, and find out more about the law school. It may be for you, and don't give up. If becoming a lawyer is your dream, you're not going to probably never become a multi-millionaire or anything, but you'll make a living and you'll make a difference. So I encourage everybody to think about going to law school, to seriously move forward with that in mind. So thank you very much. Appreciate your
Always
time.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And representing Notre Dame also. Go out fighting Irish. Yes. All right. We're out of time, but thank you and God bless.